Thank you very much for being here for another session of this comic lab within the project Claroscuros, directed by Deborah González Jurado. Today we will have the pleasure to hear our hero, Joe Sutliff, that is going to talk about complicating superheroes. He's a specialist in children's media in the Faculty of Education at Cambridge. He has co-hosted 3 conferences on comics studies at Cambridge in the last 3 years, including 2022's Comics and the Global South, which sparked a new collection of essays in progress on comics praxis in the Global South. He has also co-edited with Andrea Aramburú and Dibyadyuti Roy. He's author or co-editor of 6 books, including a book-length study of the pivotal children's cartoon Batman, the animated series, and an edited collection about the Belgian cartoonist Hergé. He's currently writing a cultural study of comic books and graphic novels in the US libraries between 1950s and 2005. And today, he's going to talk us about, the slide is getting on, hopefully, I hope, yeah, okay, it's coming. So today he's going to talk about complicating superheroes. Joe, the floor is yours. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you very much also Lee and all the others.
That's great. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so honored to be a part of this series. I've really enjoyed the other talks that have been given earlier, and it really means a lot to me to be part of this. So I'm going to talk today about complicating superheroes. I'm going to start out with a definition, and then I'm going to complicate that. Here's what we'll do today. We'll talk about what superheroes are. We'll talk about a standard argument about superheroes, which is that superheroes are fascists, and there's some truth to this claim. We'll also look at how superheroes have upheld the status quo, which is part of that claim. And then we'll complicate that idea in 3 different ways: with community, with race and ethnicity, and then with gender. And then we'll talk about a novel that is about superheroes that does some really interesting things with this idea. Okay, but first, I have to make a confession, which is that although usually when scholars talk about a subject, they try to pretend that they have no deep investment in it, that they're just very intelligent and objective people. I am not that. I love superheroes, and I always have. In fact, the first word I could spell was Joey, which was my name when I was a boy. And the second word I could spell was Batman, B-A-T-M-A-N. So I loved Batman from before I could read. And in fact, my most recent book is here on the screen. It's a book about a children's cartoon about Batman that came out in the 1990s. And I had a great deal of fun writing this book. So we need to understand from the beginning that this is something that I can be critical about, but I also love it. And there's no use pretending that I don't. So we'll start out by defining superheroes. There are a few definitions that can be helpful here. For example, Peter Coogan says that a superhero must have 3 attributes. They must have powers, they must have a sense of mission, and they must outwardly display an identity. But this already has a problem because we can think of lots of superheroes, including the best superhero, who doesn't in fact have any powers. So already that's a problem. A sense of his or her mission. This is fine, except that often, especially since the 80s, we've seen a lot of superheroes kind of drift in exactly what they were trying to do. This last one works quite well, actually. They must outwardly display an identity, by which Coogan means that they must have some kind of brand, some kind of symbol or name that becomes emblematic of them and the mission that they stand for. So this is good, but it has almost immediate problems. Loeb and Morris say that a hero is anyone who stands for the good and the right and does so against the pull of forces that would defeat their efforts. So that's what a hero is. But then a superhero is a hero, that is to say, someone who meets this first definition. A hero with superhuman powers, or at least with human abilities that have been developed to a superhuman level. And of course, that's fine. A hero with superhuman powers, or that have been developed to a superhuman level. So this last part includes Batman, so that makes it okay. But a hero is someone with superhuman powers, or at least the human abilities that have been developed to a superhuman level. That could actually describe a lot of things, including things that existed long before there were traditional superheroes. It certainly describes virtually every mythological hero, for example. So still, this is a difficult thing to define. This is my favorite definition. This is in Hassler Foster's book. He says, and this is a book about superheroes. He says, in this book, I offer no absolute definition of the superhero, nor do I attempt to provide an exhaustive summary of the figure's many historical incarnations. So I really like this definition, because with this definition, he just sort of says, I don't really know what a superhero is. Let's not worry about it. I feel like that's actually just about the most useful approach. So we've tried to talk about what superheroes are, about how to define them, and we haven't really come up with a solid definition. That's okay. I'm not too bothered by that. Let's talk instead about what superheroes mean rather than what they are. We tend to know what they are. We tend to know them when we see them. So I'm not too worried about the definition. Let's think about what it means, what a superhero means culturally. Now, one of the most common points made about superheroes, and it's largely true, is that superheroes have fundamental similarities to fascists, or the love of superheroes has within it kind of the longing that goes along with this extreme nationalist, highly centralized, highly homogenized governments. So, for example, Dan Hassler Forrest, in his book on superheroes, he says, like the action men of popular Hollywood cinema, the neoliberal agenda of the Bush Doctrine presented itself as a heroic force that operates in the arena of global geopolitics in the same way that superheroes regulate their fantasy worlds. Just as Batman and Superman fight evil forces strictly on their own terms, the Bush administration forcefully resisted international forms of regulation, instead adopting the heroic slogan, "You're either with us or against us," in its quest. Now, there's a lot here that is right, I think. So I like this comparison with the action men of popular Hollywood cinema. This idea that there's an individual who is so strong and so cunning and so brave that he can fix the problem. And he does it through this extraordinary muscularity. I also think that this is a fair comparison with the Bush Doctrine, where the Bush Doctrine said, we have the right and the moral obligation to go out into the world and destroy our opponents before they can hurt us. So they don't even have to do anything to us. We can attack them before they do anything. This is very typical of superhero stories. And it says here, just as Batman and Superman fight evil forces strictly on their own terms, that is certainly true. One of the problems of the superhero genre is that at its heart is this idea that if you are the strongest, you get to determine what is right and you get to tell everyone else how they should behave. As I said earlier, I love superheroes, and yet I have to admit, these are things that are part of the DNA of a superhero story. Hassler-Forrest goes on to say, I believe the superhero figure provides the strongest distillation of the fantasies, discourses, and anxieties that have shaped neoliberal capitalism over the past few decades. These discourses of American exceptionalism have played a decisive role in the establishment of global neoliberalism as a new form of global empire. I think this is a fair way to put it, the distillation of the fantasies, discourses, and anxieties that have shaped neoliberal capitalism. These discourses of American exceptionalism, that's an important word here, that the superhero genre relies on the idea that the superhero does not have to go through a jury, does not have to act in legal ways. They can just determine what is good and right and enforce that definition. Now, we've established then that there's an awful lot of the general political ideology of fascism in superheroes. It's also important to remember that within this political ideology was a gender dimension that is not much better than the rest of it. So Hassler-Foster says, what has remained more or less unchanged, however, is the superhero's relation to issues of gender. Occasional counterexamples notwithstanding, the superhero's body, as a rule, is clearly, one might say, excessively gendered in ways that connect to other forms of American popular mythologies. The patriarchal power embodied by the superhero therefore also extends to America's geopolitical presence as a masculine force on the world stage. I think this is such a nice way to put it, that superhero bodies tend to be not only gendered, but excessively gendered. The male bodies are extremely male. The female bodies are extremely female. They're very masculine, very feminine. And that is part of the genre, is that these bodies are shaped in a way that is excessively gendered, and their costumes display that gendering. They're very tight, they're very revealing. Part of the superhero genre is this excessive gendering of bodies. And that gendering is fundamentally heteronormative, it's fundamentally patriarchal, and it's often even homophobic. So all of these things, of course, are also part of the historical pattern of fascism. So it's another problem we have with superheroes. Now, what we've done so far is we've tried and failed to define superheroes. Then we talked about the starting idea, the most common idea about superheroes, which is that in the DNA of superheroes is fascism. And we found that that's largely true. I want to turn now to something that is connected to that. My main area is children's literature. And in children's literature, one of the things we often find is texts that want to help enforce the status quo, texts that want to help enforce what the ideas of nationhood or gender that are important in general. So I want us to look at where children's literature helps us understand this problem in superheroes. One of the things that's been really interesting about superheroes almost from the beginning is that superheroes have often had sidekicks, and sidekicks have routinely been younger than the main hero. So in this particular book by Zimmerli, he says, for the most part, I use young adult literature to illustrate and study how these roles are changing. I believe this is where the truly cutting edge of sidekick development may be found. YA has embraced the sidekick, recognizing the particular power the secondary character can have for adolescent readers in experiencing growth and finding one's place in the world. So, first of all, what this means is that young adult literature, which is one of the main areas of my research, shows how gender and age roles are changing. Sidekicks are part of that. Young adult literature has been very invested in sidekicks, and that has worked to help adolescent readers think about how they grow, about the world that they're joining, and about how their growth needs to fit into that world. So what that means is that superhero stories perform a certain role for young people, which is that it helps them understand what the world is, what the world can be, and how they need to shape themselves to fit into that world. Lauren R. O'Connor's book about Robin, who of course is Batman's sidekick, has a really interesting book about how you can see how the idea of teenager changed over time. And if you watch Robin closely over the decades, you can see some changing ideas about what a teenager is. So she points out that the word teenager didn't appear in print until at least a year after Robin's introduction, and he would not be rebranded as the Teen Wonder for almost 30 years. Readers in the 1940s understood boy or child, but the concept of the adolescent as a recognizable identity had not yet taken hold among mainstream Americans. Reading Robin allows us to see this concept being made in real time. In other words, this character, this important superhero character, helps us understand how the idea of adolescence was formed, how the idea of teenager was formed, and how books that young people read helped negotiate and navigate what those ideas were. She goes on to say, pseudoscientific and political institutions seeded ideas about adolescence. Popular culture nurtured and grew those ideas into full-blown phenomena in the first half of the 20th century. Film and children's literature, including comics, were early avenues by which images of adolescence flowed into the American mainstream. This youth literature boom was driven by the specialization of adolescence and helped fuel it, giving rise to the new so-called youth market. So here's what that means. It's saying that comic books, which is the main area that we get superheroes in the middle of the century, comic books helped tell the American mainstream what an adolescent was. It helped them understand what an adolescent was, and it helped them provide a definition of adolescence that the nation could agree on. Now, because this is telling the nation what adolescence is, once a literature for adolescence is created, superheroes are also influencing what literature for young people will be. It is actually helping design what a youth market is and what is appropriate for that market. Okay, so superheroes are actually manipulating the idea of what literature for young people can be. O'Connor goes on to say, building on progressive era child labor reform, New Deal legislation further restricted youth labor, in part to prioritize adult males who were the heads of their households for the few jobs available at the time. Now, this is something you might not know if you don't know a lot about American history, but in the first half of the 20th century, so this is the progressive era, which goes from the late 19th to the early 20th century, there was child labor reform. So that meant that there were laws that prohibited children from working or prohibited them from working in certain situations. So legislation restricted youth labor. So what that means is that it kept young people from working. It said that they were not allowed to be earning money. And what this means is that it creates the idea of adolescents and teenagers whose job is to consume and learn and grow rather than to produce. So this is kind of the creation of a teenager culture. But I'm also really interested in this second part here, that she's saying that one of the reasons, and certainly one of the effects of restricting youth labor, was that when young people were taken out of the labor pool, more adult males were able to take more jobs. So when she uses the word here, prioritize adult males, what she's saying is that the society changed to privilege grown-up men, and specifically to privilege them as the heads of their households. Now, of course, this plugs right back into our fascist point, that fascism has traditionally, I think in every historical case, fascism has also been fundamentally patriarchal. It has fundamentally been about establishing men as the important part of society and making the rest of the family, the nuclear family, dependent on them. She goes on to say, one of the earliest features of adolescence was the privileging of normative gender roles, heterosexuality, and middle to upper class nuclear family life as the idealized image of maturity. Now this is important because it's suggesting that to mature, one must adhere to gender roles, one must be heterosexual, and one must try to form a nuclear family. This is what maturity looks like, these books argued. Again, which is channeling youth into a certain fascist sense of what a society should be. She says, in short, the secret origins of adolescence framed it as a path to idealized maturity that only has room for certain bodies. Now, I really love this phrase, a path to idealized maturity that only has room for certain bodies. So idealized maturity means that there is a certain way of being an adult. And these books say you must become that kind of adult, not any other kind. And when you do, you will have a certain kind of body. That body will be gendered, so it will be masculine or feminine. That body will be heterosexual. Its job will be the production of more human beings. And it will, and for the most part, it's saying that those bodies will be white and they will be able-bodied. So we have a very homogenized, regressive, conservative sense of what maturity can look like. Okay, here's what we've said so far. So first, we tried defining superheroes. It's tricky, but we know them when we see them, and that's good enough. Second, superheroes have, virtually since they were invented, served to fetishize masculinity, to fetishize militarism, to fetishize nationalism, to fetishize fascism, and they have a special relationship with the US versions of all of those things. Third, superheroes have a close relationship with the emergence of adolescence and with the emergence of literature for adolescents. And superheroes have a special relationship with the heteronormative, patriarchal path to maturity prescribed to young people. They've been an important tool in teaching young people to grow up white, straight, productive, able-bodied, etc. Finally, as such, comics and the emerging idea of adolescence work together to support the same fascist pressures that many scholars have noted are embedded in the genre of superheroes. Now, this is all pretty depressing. It says a lot of bad things about something that I said I love. So, let's complicate things. Everything we've just said is true, but it can be more nuanced than we've said it so far. Okay, for example, this particular book, How Superheroes Model Community, makes the point, I was about to say obvious point, but it's one that needs to be made, so I guess it's not obvious, that one of the conventions of superhero stories is collaboration. Now, this is strange for fascism, because fascism has an idea of one strong demagogue who is able to rally everyone else and be a slave to his vision. But this is not the story superhero stories return to over and over again. Superhero stories love this concept of collaboration. So, for example, Mixo says, the plethora of superhero team-ups implies plurality, and that implication means that no one person, however strong and heroic, can ever claim sole responsibility for upholding a social order marked by plurality. Superheroes then must necessarily seek out and assist one another as they undertake their vision. Now, this is very strange. The idea that this genre that feels very fascist is also very much dedicated to the idea of collaboration, frequently between equals. This book by Neil Curtis also argues that we can understand the idea of sovereignty in some really nuanced ways through superheroes. For example, Curtis says, superheroes represent very complex and nuanced considerations of a range of other related issues, such as legitimacy, authority, kinship and community, the enemy and emergency powers. So contrary to received opinion, superhero comics regularly offer challenging and politically progressive treatments of them. Now, it is absolutely true that in the DNA of the superhero genre is this longing for nationalistic military that is coded masculine and straight and white. However, if we look at the history of superheroes, we also see that they frequently challenge those ideas, even though those ideas are within their DNA. Earlier, remember, we came up with this phrase that I like so much, this path to idealized maturity that only has room for certain bodies. Those bodies tend to be highly gendered, they tend to be male, they tend to be masculine, they tend to be white. However, there are strong and popular exceptions to this. For example, there's the recent Ms. Marvel television show, which of course comes from a comic book series. There's an interview with the director that I listened to, and there's a quotation I want to share here. This is actually talking with the writer. So the head writer, Bishake Ali, says Khan's character, and Khan is Ms. Marvel. She's the main superhero. She says Khan's character was informed by her own experiences growing up in England as the child of Pakistani-born parents, as well as the experiences of other second-generation writers. While the show is written for a broad audience who love the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Ali says it also speaks, in part, to people who rarely get to see themselves be the protagonists, who have suffered from a history of poor media representation in the West. In other words, this is a superhero story that is very much contrary to that one body that was allowed in the superhero genre. Going on, she says, like any teenager, Khan occasionally clashes with her parents, but Ali is quick to point out that the show avoids the trope of the second-generation immigrant kid rejecting her community. Instead, we see the character attending traditional dance classes and going to the mosque. There's no note of, these people, this culture oppresses me, and I'm in direct conflict with them, Ali says. That really isn't at all what we're chasing. Deeply personal stories, things that feel like a painful excavation of self, are always what are going to attract me. Okay, so this is important because we're seeing here how the story is a story that relies on what it means to be a teenager. As we saw earlier, superhero stories and the concept of adolescence emerged at about the same time, and they influenced each other. So this still relies on the idea of what it is to be a teenager, and there are still clashes with the parents. However, it leaves out the idea that there's a clash over being an immigrant or a clash over the non-white, non-Christian community. She has clashes with her parents because that's part of the teenage genre, but they've deliberately avoided or even removed that element of the genre that suggests that there's something wrong with the non-white community. Instead, the non-white community is accepted and is not a source of conflict. Okay, we also want to complicate this with gender. I want to just quickly shout out to a recent book that I really love, Queer Anxieties of Young Adult Literature and Culture, by a chap named Derek Mason. He's a Canadian scholar, does fantastic work. In Derek's book, he talks a lot about how queerness and YA culture have actually dovetailed, and some really fantastic things have happened there. I also need to point out just really briefly that even in the most conservative parts of superhero stories, we've seen some changes. For example, many of you will know the story of the Comics Code Authority. In the US, the Comics Code Authority was a form of self-censorship, and I can talk about it more in Q&A if you would like. But the Comics Code Authority was a censorship tool that the comics industry put on itself. And it said, here are the rules about what can be in comic books. In the original, this was one of the rules. Illicit sex relations are neither to be hinted nor portrayed. Violent love scenes, as well as sexual abnormalities, are unacceptable. Sex perversion, or any inference to same, is strictly forbidden. Now, of course, at this time, homosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, these things were regarded as perversions. So when they were saying that these perversions cannot be shown, what they meant was only heterosexuality can be shown, only heterosexuality can be alluded to. All right, so that's the original rule from the 1950s. However, this same authority actually changed its rules in the 1980s. And here's what they say, here's what they say in the more recent version of the code. They say character portrayals will be carefully crafted and show sensitivity to national, ethnic, religious, sexual, political, and socioeconomic orientations. So it will show sensitivity to. Contrast that with the idea that it's perverse and is forbidden. If it is dramatically appropriate for one character to demean another because of his or her sex or sexual preference, the comics should never assign ultimate responsibility for these conditions to the characters themselves. Heroes should be role models and should reflect the prevailing social attitudes. Now, I'm not the first person to point this out. Esther Didal is actually the one who got this from. And the point here is that the Comics Code Authority actually changed to be not only tolerant of, but protective of a more heterogeneous understanding of sexuality. Further, we can actually find queer history in comics from very early on. This is a recent edited collection. I'm quoting here from the introduction. From comics' earliest days, their queerness was emergent, incipient, and implicit. Now, in sequential art the world over, LGBTQ plus comics proliferate across every genre and type. LGBTQ plus characters and ways of being are apt to feature organically in the worlds of mainstream commercial comics, to anchor narratives of their own, and to propel a multitude of alternative press comics. So again, what this means is that within the genre of superheroes, there's a certain fascist fear of queerness. However, comics have also always had queerness in them. And this is not true just in Anglophone comics or Francophone comics. It's throughout the world, in fact. Okay, so we've talked about what superhero stories are. We've talked about their fascist, racist, heterocentric, heteronormative, nationalist, materialistic, or not materialistic, but militaristic inclinations. What I want to do now is show you a book that I love and that I teach. It's a wonderful novel. It's a superhero novel. It's a prose novel. It's not a graphic novel. So this is a book with words and no drawings, if you can imagine such a thing. Dreadnought is the first book in a 3-book series of prose novels. They are about a teenager, again. This one is a girl, so it's a teen girl superhero. The protagonist, her name is Dani. Dani was born in a girl's body, in a boy's body, but has always known she was a girl. Okay, so she was assigned male at birth. She has the body of a male, but she knows that she's really a girl, and that's how she's lived her life so far. When the world's greatest superhero, whose name is Dreadnought, gives her his powers, her body transforms so that she not only has powers, but is also obviously a girl. Part of being Dreadnought is that you get your ideal body. So when Dani, whose body appears to be male, inherits the powers of Dreadnought, she gets her ideal body, and her ideal body is visibly female. Okay, so we have this really cool superhero novel that is about a trans teenage girl. Now I'm going to look at some quotations, and I want to look at how, well, in a moment we'll look at quotations, and we want to look at how they fit into what we've said so far. So our first question was, are superheroes inherently fascist? Yes, they are. They play to fantasies about might makes right justice and international policy. Yes, they are fascist. They play to heteronormative anxieties about bodies and desire. However, no, they are not inherently fascist because they also emphasize cooperation and team building in ways that do not fit with fascism. And again, no, they're not fascist because they often serve as fantasies for the disenfranchised. And they take on those stories very well. Do superheroes support the gendered and racialized status quo? Yes, they do. They reinforce a standardized path to maturity that privileges standardized bodies and patriarchal family structures. However, no, they don't, because there is room in the genre for brown and female bodies. No, they don't, because queerness has long been present in comics, including superhero stories, and even the code, which is the most regressive, conservative part of comics, has become more accommodating over time. So now we're going to look at where Dreadnought tangles with these debates we've looked at. Here's a quotation from not long after Dani has gotten her powers. Dani is talking to another superhero who is a scientist. This superhero's name is Doc Impossible. And as Dani and Doc are talking about what it means to be a superhero, they talk about these ideas of superpowers versus special abilities, which you may remember has actually been a problem we dealt with back in the definition slides. Okay, so here's a quotation from the novel. Dani says, "But those are just special abilities, right? Not real superpowers?" Doc Impossible spreads her fingers out and waggles her hands from side to side. That line between special abilities and superpowers is something that nonpartisans came up with. A lot of the nonpartisans even have abilities that, if used to their full extent, would be superpowers, no matter how much they torture the definition. They don't want to be associated with us. Someone hears you have a superpower and suddenly they don't want to date you or hire you or rent an apartment to you, because everyone assumes superpowers mean you have super enemies. And who wants to be out at dinner with someone when a psychopath in a black cape shows up and starts melting people with a death ray? So all of a sudden it's, no sir, I don't have a superpower, I just have a special ability. It helps cut down on the jealousy too. Now this is important because we can see that this superhero story is actually getting into the argument over what counts as a superhero, what counts as a superpower. This is important because it shows a certain reflexivity that is built into superhero stories. It's also important, though, because it's actually rejecting a colonized Western, one might say fascist, way of thinking about how everything must be categorized. We must have descriptions that are scientific and medical that separate one kind of person from another. So this story is rejecting that kind of thing. In our next quotation, Dani is flying. She's very angry. She's thinking about her adolescence before she got her powers, before she looks more like a girl's body. The shelter of boyhood ended, and they called me a young man. For no reason at all, they looked at the things that felt right to me, and they took them. Even down to the way I carry my books and cross my legs. They took it. They took everything. Puberty came, and my body turned on me too. Watching every part of myself I liked rot away one day at a time, a horrified imposter staring back at me. Watching the other girls, the ones they let be girls, head in the other direction. Every day, torn away further from myself, chained down tighter, suffocated, strangled. This is a fantastic passage, in part because it really makes plain that the gendering of human beings is a cultural, non-natural thing. That genders are constructions that societies make, and therefore they are things that can be resisted and questioned. Now that doesn't fit at all with what we've said about superheroes earlier. What we said earlier was that superheroes have this fascist tendency to present highly gendered bodies that bifurcate along traditional heteronormative lines. So first of all, this is important because it says there's something wrong with thinking of gender that way. It's also important because it is specifically related to the idea of adolescence. Remember, we've said that superheroes and the concept of being a teenager, these things influenced each other. Here, what Dani is saying is that that idea of adolescence ended the period when there was some gender fluidity, that being a teenager is itself part of the problem. Here's another quotation. Here, Doc Impossible is examining Dani shortly after the transformation. And Doc Impossible is saying, here are all the great things. You know, you've got these powers, you've got this strength, you've got this invulnerability. However, there are some bad things. She says, here's the bad news. If you want kids, you're going to have to let me convert some of your blood into sperm and have someone else provide the egg and womb. You don't have a uterus. You'll never get pregnant. I'm falling down deep, down into a deep pit. And at the bottom, there are flames. She lashes out in anger. She's very hurt by this. What the hell, kid, says Doc Impossible, rising. Sorry, I sigh. The bubbling cauldron of frustration is still there, even if it's not boiling over. I guess I just thought that I was finally a real girl. Hey, none of that. She takes me by the shoulders. You think it's a uterus that makes a woman? Bullshit. You feel like a girl, you live it, it's part of you, then you're a girl. That's the end of it. No quibbling. You're as real a girl as anyone. So obviously what's happening here is that we have a superhero story that is endorsing a certain idea of bodies, where those bodies do not fit into that strict path to maturation that we talked about before. Here we have a body that will not contribute to the kind of nuclear family production that nationalist fascism relied on. It's one that also quibbles with the idea of a clear gender distinction. Our next quotation, Dani is facing down a superpowered bad guy who is about to murder a non-superpowered person. Dani is much, much more powerful than this bad guy. So the bad guy starts hitting Dani, but Dani grabs him, flies up into the air, and frightens him. Dani begins to feel the satisfaction of being stronger than a bully, and her memories of years of being tormented for not performing masculinity well, those memories come bubbling up. She thinks, but that feeling of helplessness is falling behind me as fast as the city lights. Bosco's blows get weaker but faster as his panic begins to take hold. His terror makes me feel amazing. I begin to laugh. Every stupid, half-formed fantasy of standing up to the bullies and beating them into a hospital bed comes back to me at once. Years of bottled rage are uncorked. Someone has to pay for what was done to me. Now I am strong enough to make him pay. But then he starts weeping, the bastard. His weeping ruins it, and probably saves me from doing something I'd regret for the rest of my life. I really like this passage because this passage is honest about how part of the pleasure of a superhero story is the fantasy of being so strong that you can make the right thing happen. And that pleasure that comes from being the strongest person. So it recognizes the attraction of that idea, and it reveals it as something that we need to resist. I like that this story is honest about the attraction of that feeling, because it's true. We like that feeling, and we need to acknowledge it. However, resisting it does not line up with the fascist ideology that we've seen at the heart of superhero stories. Okay, we're almost done. I think we've just got 2 more quotations. So Danny and Doc Impossible are talking about a former superhero whom Doc Impossible and the other heroes turned into the police because he'd been going after a possibly crooked member of the government. And Doc Impossible says, look, we know the government is dirty, parts of it at least. Doc Impossible's shoulders sag a little, and disgust is written all over her face. That doesn't change the fact that he crossed a lot of lines we can't let one of our own cross. You think tonight was bad? Things that are 10,000 times worse happen when capes try to police the government. It would turn us into a police state overnight, and if we were really lucky, that's all it would do to us. So what's happening here is that we have a superhero story that is recognizing that the superhero genre is inclined toward fascism, and that we must recognize that and we must resist that temptation. Even when we're right, we must resist that temptation. Being right does not justify transforming from a pluralistic society to a fascist society. You know what? I'm going to skip this one because I'm running long and we've already covered these points. So here's what we've done then. We've talked about what superheroes are. We've talked about, sorry, I'm trying to get rid of this. We've talked about what superheroes are. We've talked about the ideology that's at the heart of it, the pleasures of it. And we've also seen that superhero stories don't have to be those things. In many ways, superhero stories can be the opposite of those things. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you to you, Joel. Thank you to you.
Wow, what a nice trip.
Yeah.
What a nice trip.
I wanted to say some words in Spanish for the users of laboratory, the watchers. Buenas tardes, no sé si se me verá en la grabación, espero que sí, y también vamos a presentar a Liv, que está aquí colaborando en los laboratorios y se va a venir también para Málaga, para el congreso, que ya estamos a días y es un día especial porque ha llegado Diana Castilleja, estamos las dos juntas aquí en el aula virtual de la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras de Málaga, en el proyecto Claroscuros, y que tenemos el congreso ahí en ciernes, ese toro de congreso que lo vamos a sacar para adelante, que va a ser súper bonito, la bomba. Así que, bueno, el laboratorio de cómics es el que ha estado llevando Diana, que ha sido el mejor laboratorio de todos, el mejor planificado. Y Tania también, que no nos lo vamos a olvidar. De hecho, el otro día estuve hablando con ella, no puede venir al congreso. es el laboratorio que ha llegado hasta el final, que ha estado mejor programado desde el principio y va a cumplir todas las sesiones que estaban programadas. Es el único. Tengo algunos que me han faltado la última tal, pero el de Diana, esto es, bueno, es una experta ya.
Cuento con unos ángeles maravillosos que dijeron sí desde el inicio y se implicaron al 500%. Thank you very much, Joe, liebe, hartelijk bedankt, liebe, por su petición. Pablo, que nos falta aquí, también Gustavo y Eva, que se va a unir con nosotros. Realmente este laboratorio ha salido adelante gracias a que ustedes de manera muy generosa brincaron en el proyecto, se comprometieron y lo hicieron al 100%. Thank you very much, Joe, also for being part of this and being here. Even if you are not in the same continent, if you have to take a little bit of schedule, a different schedule for us, thank you very much.
It's my pleasure.
Daniel Romero también.
Daniel que ha estado presente como espectador y nos mandó también unas preguntas que también hice llegar a Joe para que pudiera iniciarse la conversación, ¿no? Libe.
Yeah, I've got a remark for Joe. So thank you very much for your presentation. But I can imagine that the term fascism comes from your secondary literature. But in fact, I strongly object against that term because, well, perhaps this has to do with our European historical experience.
Yeah.
Perhaps I've been thinking about other possibilities, perhaps law and order, perhaps totalitarianism. Because if you think historically, in the 40s and 50s, when the superheroes were in full swing, they defended American intervention dedicated to fight against fascism. Those strange enemies were, well, you read the Nazis in them.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
That's one of, and then I was thinking also about society in general. I'm from Belgium. Belgium was a Catholic country mostly, and certainly in the 40s and 50s, when my parents were young, my parents have been raised with those criteria. So what was it to be mature? Heterosexual, socially productive, married, and fathering and mothering children. When you are Catholic, you had some sideways. You could be a priest or a nun. But basically, that was the social model. Yeah. And even if you see communism started defending free love. But then when they saw what the result was, orphans in the streets of Moscow, they changed, and they also favored heteronormative families. I remember even a novel by Cuban authors in the 60s, I think it's Reinaldo Arenas, correct me, Diana, who had to abandon Cuba because he had to suffer from political persecution because he was openly homosexual. So I think that the term fascism should be replaced by something else.
Yeah. I think that's a fair correction. As you've pointed out, the reason that I was using it was that the people I was arguing against were using it, and I was trying to be fair to them. But of course, you're right that that there are other ideologies, there are other political systems, there are other religious systems, for example, that have many of these same qualities too. I do think. I think the biggest problem with the use of the term fascism is that it has a specific historical antecedent. And so if we're going to say something is fascist, we really ought to be careful and make sure that we're saying it's like that specific antecedent. However, again, it's not my term, but if I'm being fair to the people I'm arguing against, fascism was primarily about militarism, and about nationalism, and about a strong, a strong demagogue who was the visionary at the center and kept everybody else in line. And I do think that although we see those in other places too, I do think that those things kind of are at the heart of a lot of what is pleasurable about superheroes. But of course, you're right that this is a place where the people I am arguing with have not chosen their terminology very accurately.
Yes, and then in fashion, you have that strong leader, and then masses, but you have structured masses. You have actual populism. You have the leader, but then the people all around who feel more or less identified. And my remembrance of Batman and Robin are way back, black and white television in the 60s. But then it's far more individualistic than fashion was. The totalitarian ideologies were not individualistic at all.
That's an excellent point.
The American flavor, that's just...
That's a great point. That's right.
And the capitalist liberal vision of society.
That's right. That's a really good point. So I maybe the most accurate thing would say, I like your phrase, is to say that it's the American flavor of fascism, which manages to graft neoliberal capitalism on top of fascism. And that's where we get this kind of superhero. That's a good observation.
And I have another question. In your many lectures of young adult literature, do they have parodies of superheroes? So failed superheroes or heroes, figures that realize great enterprises without being able to fly or to transform themselves?
Yeah. So you're asking if there's a parody of superheroes in young adult literature. Is that right?
Yeah. Because in adult comics in Spain they have.
Right. No, I don't know about those. I can't think of one. I cannot think of one in prose literature. It was definitely there in Mad Magazine, right? Mad Magazine did this kind of thing all the time for decades. But I don't think we had it in young adult literature. You're saying that it existed in Spain, is that right?
Yeah, well, I'm working for the conference on a series called Las Aventuras del Capitán Torresmo, so the adventures of Captain Torresmo. And if you see Captain Torresmo, he is a walking parody because he isn't tall at all. He's like a small figure. He has wrinkles and he has an enormous prominent nose. He speaks the local dialect, but he's extremely handy. And his victories are based on he's a handiman. So he knows the
that's
trick.
so interesting.
He can repair electricity in a phantasmagoric micro world who has like slight resemblances with consumer society. So it's absolutely funny.
Yeah, I love that. That sounds hysterical. I would love to read that.
I'm afraid I'm not translated.
No, that's all right. That's all right. Well, thank you for those questions. That was super interesting. I think that's these are some good corrections to that terminology, and I need to think about that more. But I love your phrase. I'm going to borrow this phrase of it's the American flavor of fascism.
Okay, I have a comment. For instance, when you said the books you show us, the studies you show us, talk about this, you have to have the body to fit in. They insisted on this. But now, if we see a little bit, what do we have right now? We have kinds of clones, and we have so many varieties of superheroes. So before the superhero was a kind of a model. I'm not saying a good one or not, but it was kind of a model.
Yeah.
But with all this variety.
Yeah, we do have a lot of variety, though I should point out we still have very, very few fat superheroes. This seems to be one of the last things that we're willing to compromise on, that the bodies have to be strong. Well, fat people can be strong. They have to be thin and they have to be trim. They have to be sinewy and muscular. I remember years ago, Trina Robbins, you may know her. She's a wonderful historian of women in comics, and she writes and draws comics herself also. Trina Robbins was doing a talk about showing different different races of women, for example. And she said, this is a good thing. And of course, she's right. And then someone in the audience said, yeah, it's too bad there still aren't fat women, though. And Trina said, well, I don't know. I mean, if you have to punch and run fast and that kind of thing, you probably can't be fat. And I remember talking to the person who asked the question in the audience later, and she said, I don't understand. You're okay with the idea that a person can fly, but you're not okay with the idea that a fat person can be strong? That doesn't work. So of course you're right, Diana, and it's very good that we have this variety. There are a few places where we've got some walls up still, and there is one interesting exception to this. I don't think I have the book up here with me, but there's a woman, a female superhero. Oh, her name is Harbinger. Here, I'll put it in chat. Her name is Harbinger, and she's from a minor press in the U.S. I can't remember which one. She's fat and is a really good character. I've really enjoyed her stories. So there's one exception to this, but only the one.
And it's also a woman.
And it's a woman. That's right. Yeah.
Because now that you're talking about it, I'm thinking the age was never an issue.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Children with also adults or even with gray hair. So the age was never an issue.
Yeah. Well, and only for men. That's right. I guess, of course, the exception would be the Hernandez brothers, Los Bros, that we do see big, older female superheroes with them sometimes. But of course, the Hernandez brothers are so brilliant that they're the exception to every bad rule. So it almost doesn't count that I can bring them up.
I don't know, Joe, if there exists some theory or hypothesis or something about this idea that I'm going to explain now. It's maybe each civilization needs its own superheroes, that has always existed. In the ancient world, we are been talking a little bit before. Yeah. The ancient world has the heroes.
Yeah.
Heroes and semi-human, semi-gods.
Yes.
For medieval, medium age have the saints. The saints are kind of superheroes,
Mm-hmm.
They did marvelous things and were very human also. The psychological image has become later because the saints were very unequal in the moral, but finally they're saints. And after that, I think there is a change, little change in the Renaissance. Maybe we say that. Renaissance, it begins one kind of exaltation, no se dice exaltación, exaltation of some individuals who did different things as go around the world, or Magallanes and all those conquerors, and that was in my
Yeah. I do understand. I do understand. Yeah. Yeah, you are yeah, other people have other people have suggested this too, that we should be thinking about superheroes as continuous with mythological heroes or saints or something like that. There's a lot of benefit to that idea. For example, if we say that superheroes and mythological heroes overlap, then we can look at the places where they're a little different, and we can tell something about how ideas of heroism have changed. So that's useful. I think that one of the reasons that we have superheroes now instead of those other kind of characters is that superheroes are more marketable by capitalism. That superheroes have the brand, they have the icon, on the chest that is very marketable. They also avoid religious affiliation, which means that they can be marketed to multiple religions, people of different religions, and they they can work transmedially. They can work in comics or novels or animation or film. So I think the reason that superheroes exist so strongly now, and we don't have the other kinds of heroes, is that this kind of hero lends itself to global capitalism better than the other ones do. But I do think that you're right to make that comparison.
Maybe if in Middle Age comics existed, maybe El Cid could be one hero.
Yeah, that works.
Yes,
That works.
The end of the Middle Age.
Yes, so this epic literature also gave us some heroes.
Yeah,
I think that works.
But the Cid is a very strange personage in Spanish literature.
Yes,
it's very strange. Not common, not usual. Because no? Well, you know more than me, because you are literature professor of literature, but yes.
And maybe Lazarillo could be kind of a parody of these heroes or so, like the ones you are saying, for instance, Superman. And I was thinking when Live, you said something about these parody heroes, superheroes. I was thinking in the Chapulín Colorado in Mexico, the red grasshopper, maybe for you, Joe. It was kind of a parodic hero. Was an aged adult with a really funny suit.
Yeah, I love that.
Underwear.
Oh, that sounds great.
That's kind of the sign of the superhero, the underwear.
Oh, that's so great. I really like that. That sounds wonderful.
But he was just funny, and I always thought this one, like the Mexican answer, to these big superheroes with a really good built body. And so it was someone around his 40s, 50s.
Yeah.
That was always, that always had superpowers.
Yeah.
Maybe really few superpowers, but they worked for us. So it was also this kind of identification. We also had our superhero.
Yeah. Oh, I really like that. That's such a cool story.
It began as a character, a TV character, but then he got his own comic series.
Ooh.
Almost every, that was from Roberto Gómez Bolaños. Made Chapulín Colorado, yes. So he made a lot of characters, the Chavo del Ocho, Chapulín Colorado. But that's also important to say that all his characters began with CH, with this sound, because it was the first sound children, Spanish-speaking children could pronounce better. So if you
That's really great.
make a kind of study of the names of his characters.
Yeah. Oh, that's so interesting. What a great idea. What a great marketing idea.
Yes, it was a nice.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, thank you very much for this. I think we've probably asked all the questions we need to ask, but I really appreciate you having me. It's been lovely to get to talk about this.
Have you rushed, Joe? Because we have not give him the answer of Danny.
No, we have what?
Danny has sent some answer.
No, but it was a long comment, so I sent it directly to Joe so he can read and talk
And
with Danny.
and the last question from my side. You think, Joe, it's we need to distinguish. We need to do one difference between those kind of superheroes, popular superheroes, that they have not superpowers as the way of North American superheroes. It should be, we should do one category apart of superheroes have very special characteristics that are not comparison with other kind of heroes. You know, we need to do that difference just for a group of North American superheroes, or can we now respect that and mix with other kind of heroes? As we have been talking now here. Superhéroes, can we, or we should respect that pure genre of comics? How can we live with that?
Well, okay. Yeah. For my opinion, it's okay if they mix. I don't have a problem with that. What I always tell my doctoral students when they want to propose a certain definition, or they want to separate something, or they want to join something, what I always tell them is this: you can do anything you want methodologically, as long as you can convince your reader that doing that thing shows us something that we couldn't see otherwise. So for me, I don't care. They can mix, they can be separate, I don't care. But if separating them shows us something that we couldn't see when they were together, okay, then let's separate them. If mixing them shows us something that we couldn't see when they're apart, then let's mix them. So for me, I don't care. We can do whatever we want. The real rule is, whatever you choose, it has to show us something we couldn't see otherwise. That's the only rule in my mind.
Okay. I guess it's time to bring with superheroes.
Yeah, that's right.
El 27 de noviembre de 2023. Me gusta sellar un poquito la fecha en los vídeos.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Joe, for this complicating superheroes talk. So you see, we are still complicating the complicated things.
Thank you, Joe.
So thank you very much, and we hope to see you again for the next and last Comic Lab. It's going to be from Eva van de Wille. So she's going to talk us about El Club Mickey, recentrando a les niñes españoles. No quiero decir mucho pero bueno, para mostrar los y las niñas y niños españoles y españolas y anexas de 1935 en una revista global que va a tener lugar el 7 de diciembre, misma hora y mismo canal.
Yeah, that was a Batman reference, wasn't it? I like that. Well, I can't wait for it. Eva does great work, so that'll be wonderful.
Oh, that's really nice. I really like the synergies we are creating in this lab.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank
so
you.
See See you, my friends, next time.
Okay, see you.
Gracias.
Bye.
Chao, Liv, te vemos
Hasta prontito.
Gracias, adiós. Besito.
Chao.
A ver, nos salimos bien.
Para la grabación.
A ver, tengo que llamar a Joe porque...
Sí, sí, ya, adelante, adelante, adelante.
No, ahora no. A ver, ¿qué pinta tengo yo? Mira la pinta que yo tengo. Yo quiero salir hablando y mira los pelos. Diana, mira. Como vaya a grabar el vídeo, verás. Mira los pelos.
El día de hoy me hubiera peinado, por Dios.
Y tú también tienes unos pelos que no veas, pero lo mío es tremendo, mira. Tenemos unos pelos. Bueno, nena, pues vámonos, que esto ya se grabe solo.
Ajá.
Esto ya se tiene que... Eso empieza ya a dar vuelta a la piruleta. Bueno, ¿tú querrás cenar o vamos a tomarnos algo, no?
Sí.
Tú te tendrás que acostar
me das un
tempranito.
segundo para terminar un par de cosas que estoy aquí.
Yo no he abierto hoy ni el email.